in Colombia. In my mind, I often contrast the mythological worldview of the postmodern West, our inveterate faith in hyper-individualism, materialism, and technological progress, with that of indigenous cultures I visited. A few years ago, I helped organize 2 retreats with the Kogi and Arawak people, indigenous groups who live high up in the remote mountains of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. The Kogi and Arawak wear peaked caps and homemade white clothes, which they weave on their looms. With uninterrupted traditions going back thousands of years, they are autonomous, self-reliant, and peaceful. The Kogi call themselves the elder brother, and the modern culture of the West, younger brother. They only became known to the outside world a few decades ago, when they began to issue warnings about the potentially catastrophic consequences of our continued mistreatment of the earth. The heirs of a pre-Incan civilization, they express a living philosophy that unites the physical and spiritual worlds. The future leaders and shamans of the Kogi, called mamos because they identify with the mother, the feminine principle of fertility, soul, and soil, are recognized in early childhood. As children, these future teachers spend as long as 9 years in dark retreats, never directly exposed to the light of day. They believe that the origin of everything that happens on earth begins in the spiritual realm, which is darkness. Before they can become mamos, wisdom keepers, they must know the darkness, the formless, and learn its ways. Rooted in an ancient oral tradition, the Kogi and Arawak mamos project great dignity, rarely wasting a word. According to ethnobotanist Wade Davis, when the priests or mamos speak, they immediately reveal that their reference points are not of our world. They refer to the Spanish conquest as if it were a recent event. They talk openly of the force of creation, or Se, the spiritual core of all existence, and Aluna, human thought, soul, and imagination. What is important, what has ultimate value, is not what is measured and seen, but what exists in the many realms of meanings and connections that lie beneath the tangible realities of the world, linking all things. For the Kogi, all life is sacred, a continuum. Seemingly simple actions have great significance. I found the mamos to be the most centered people I had ever met. For them, every moment is ceremony. The only time that exists is sacred time. The Kogi men chew bitter coca leaves out of a gourd, the paporo, which they mix with powdered seashells. They meditatively scrape the stick, which they use to extract the white chalky powder around the outside of the gourd. The gourd has a womb-like shape and represents the universe. The coca leaf, they say, helps them to speak the word of truth. When the Kogi brought together the men in our group to try it for the first time, we sat together in darkness for over an hour. They asked us to contemplate its effects. Over time, I found that chewing the leaves induced a state of clarity and calm. I felt it connected my mind with my heart, so different than cocaine, which extracts the coca from the leaf and synthetically binds it with sulfuric acid to maximize a reptilian robotic rush. Over the course of a number of days, I listened attentively to the teachings of the mamos, often conveyed through stories and allegories. I wanted to grasp the essence of what they came to teach us. Nature is a book that we learn to read by understanding its signs, Don Leonardo, the Kogi Mamo, told us. By interpreting the signs, the Kogi communicate directly with the cosmos. He gave us an example of how a Kogi might walk past a dog with a butterfly in its mouth on a path. From that encounter, he might know that his uncle in a distant town had passed away. The Kogi philosophy resembles Taoism, where the true man, who acts through non-action, maintains the balance between heaven and earth. The human being in the worldview of the Kogi, as in the Tao, not accidental or contingent. We have an essential function in the cosmos. Our role is to reflect its equilibrium and harmony, thus maintaining order. We support nature's continuity through our action and intentions, also through our prayers and meditations. Over the course of a week, the Kogi instructed us in ways to make payments to the earth. We imprinted the energy of our prayers and intentions into cotton balls, which they then buried and hid in sacred places. Through our translator, I asked if the Kogi and Arawak believed that the physical world is a direct reflection of our level of consciousness or spirituality. Don Leonardo smiled. "That is why we walked 25 hours down from our home in the mountains, to tell you that," he said. According to the Kogi, the reason we now experience increasing earthquakes, tsunamis, nuclear meltdowns, floods, and other natural and man-made cataclysms across the world is ultimately spiritual. Industrial waste is a result of our low level of spiritual development. Pollution reflects our lack of awareness of our interdependence with nature and cosmos. The world is in turmoil because we have failed to maintain a sacred reciprocal relationship with Mother Earth. We lost our way. The nihilism of our culture reflects this. The Kogi and Arawak see nature and man as a continuum. They believe our actions and even our thoughts influence the invisible spiritual worlds that express themselves in all natural phenomena through the weave of synchronicity in which we are enmeshed. Our technological society perceives nature and the physical world as resources, devoid of spirit, which we can consume however we want. Increasingly, the elites in our society drink ayahuasca and explore other aspects of indigenous spiritual traditions. But we have not integrated the humility and reverence for the creative forces of nature that we find in cultures like that of the Kogi. We have not yet understood that life itself is the prayer and the ceremony. That's a little section. So yes, this is really my third book, and my first book came out in 2002 and was Breaking Open the Head, and that book was about psychedelic shamanism. And for that book, I visited tribal cultures in West Africa. I went through a Bwiti initiation, taking a substance called iboga, and I went down to the Amazon in Ecuador and worked with a tribe called the Sequoia, taking ayahuasca. And I visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico, in the mountains of Oaxaca, where the West rediscovered mushrooms back in the 1950s. I sort of wrote about, the question posed by the book was, why had the modern world suppressed and rejected and kind of reviled the psychedelic experience, the visionary experience that so many indigenous cultures around the world consider to be so important and even essential to their spiritual culture. And the book was also a journey of my own kind of awakening. I started, the genesis of it was my own personal kind of spiritual crisis. And I sort of remembered my psychedelic experiences as very profound. And so I decided, when I was in college, I decided to make that the subject of a long, investigation. And over the course of writing the book, my worldview changed from being a scientific materialist and a skeptic to having so many experiences of, what Carl Jung would talk about as the psyche, psychic and paranormal and esoteric kind of experiences, that I had to kind of accept that there was more going on than I had realized, which ultimately was a very exciting discovery. And Breaking Open the Head led me to my second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which looked at the prophetic knowledge of indigenous cultures like the Hopi and the Maya, and also the prophetic thought systems of a lot of other cultures, like Judeo-Christian culture, with its ideas of apocalypse and revelation, and the Yuga cycle that the Indian Hindus talk about. And because I felt that, having gone through the process of writing the first book and having realized that these indigenous cultures had, that their way of knowing that we had suppressed actually had a lot of validity and a lot of wisdom for us, I began to feel that we needed to take their way of understanding our world much more seriously. And but we also needed to be able to understand their form of knowledge through our prism. So in that book, I looked at a lot of Western thinkers like Heidegger and Nietzsche and Rudolf Steiner and Carl Jung to kind of look for different ways of understanding and articulating what these traditional cultures had to share with us. And I also stepped back to look at various reasons why we might think that we're in a time of tremendous transformation or transition that include things like the evolution of technology, it's very quick, right? The last few centuries, we had started with horse and buggies, and now we have rockets, and capitalism has become this global force that's meshed the whole world together into one big market. And the internet has evolved really quickly over the last decades to mesh us all together kind of into one global brain. And it almost seems like there's a process, like an evolutionary or teleological process happening. And as part of that globalization process, we now can see like all of the world's esoteric and mystical traditions are now kind of out in the open, and a lot of hidden knowledge is now revealed. So that also, I think, is a kind of key to maybe thinking about our time as a transformation time, that we can see that if you look at Kabbalah or Sufism or shamanism or Tibetan Buddhism, they sort of correlate, like they're not really in conflict with each other. The conflict is between these like traditional religious structures, that push us towards wars and disasters and so on. And then also I believe that science and mysticism are sort of coming together, which is like, what Friedrich Capra began to figure out decades ago when he wrote the Tao of Physics, that quantum physics kind of could lead us to have an understanding of the nature of reality that really correlates better with Eastern mystical traditions, like the Hindu tradition or Buddhism. So I finished 2012, which came out about 10 years ago, and each book for me is really like, comes from like a deep sense of a question or a few questions that I just feel I don't know how to answer, and I look around my culture and try to find, a book or something, some way of understanding, and I feel that I can't find it, and it makes me very uncomfortable. And I'm like, okay, well, if nobody else has figured this out, then maybe that's what I have to do. And with this book, I felt that, having done the 2012 book and understanding that these various cultures talk about a transition between the fifth world and the sixth world, or the age of the fifth sun and the age of the sixth sun. The fourth world and the fifth world is what the Hopi say, and the age of the fifth sun and the age of the sixth sun is what the Aztecs talk about. And in the New Age, there was a New Age culture which talked about it as like a shift in frequency or change of dimensions or whatever, spiritual evolution. But I felt that if there was going to be such a change and it was going to be a bit positive one, we had to understand what that could mean in terms of our, material, tangible systems. What type of, technologies, what type of social systems would allow human society to continue and to flourish and to thrive. Because certainly if we look at what's happening ecologically, it looks like we're heading in another direction. And I do like to take like a few minutes and depress everybody in the audience with the ecological statistics. Just you guys look like you can handle it. You look pretty tough. Do people know how many species going extinct per day? Yeah, it's like 150 to 200, and they estimate there's like 8.2 million species or something on the planet. So that's like, if you do the math, we're losing 10% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity every 10 to 15 years. And obviously we can't keep doing that for too many 10-year cycles, right? We have over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now. And the last time there was this much CO2 in the air, sea levels were 100 feet higher and temperatures were 4 degrees Celsius warmer. So that's kind of where we're heading right now. But we've also learned from studying past epochs of climate change that it's not something that happens like incrementally over many centuries. There are like all these positive feedback loops get engaged, and there are like sudden rapid spikes. And there's a huge amount of like methane frozen under the Siberian, Arctic, the peat bogs and so on, which gets released, which, and methane is 30 times, more potent as a heat trapping gas than CO2, even though it only lasts in the atmosphere for 10 years, where CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for about 100 years. So you get the methane triggers like a large scale, process, or it can, which is what caused like the Permian mass extinction 250 million years ago or something, when 95% of all life on Earth went extinct in a short period. So yeah, the stakes are very high, and it's unfortunate that our culture and our media, sort of, doesn't really give us the sense of what needs to happen and so on. For various reasons. I mean, so I guess in the book I was like, okay, like let's confront all of this. Let's not hide from this anymore. Let's recognize this is where we're at as a species right now. Let's look at the whole thing. And let's say, okay, well, considering everything, what can we do? What are our options? How could we make a world still that was, successful? and it took me many years to kind of boil it down in a way, and I had to go on many like false starts, and I lost like 2 years reading like French political theory at one point. But essentially, when I think about it, it's like there are three main areas that are kind of like the big areas that all kind of work together. And one of them would be the technical support systems that we rely on, which includes energy and industry and farming and so on. And then one is the social systems, like our political and economic system. And then the other is, the third one would be our consciousness, the mass consciousness, the collective consciousness, which is shaped by culture and includes like, ideology, values, beliefs, and so on. Like sort of, and in a sense, I think the media kind of very much programs the collective mind in terms of its like behavior patterns and habits, like what do people buy, how do they imagine relationships should be, how do they relate to authority and so on. So those are the three areas that I kind of looked at in the book. And in a way, the technical part of what we would have to do is the simplest to grasp, and it is achievable. It's just not really achievable in the current political economic system. And obviously we're seeing, with Trump's election, a radical movement in the other direction from, what would seem to be necessary. But I guess in a way, I don't think that's necessarily terrible, because, under Obama and Clinton, we were definitely not moving anywhere near fast enough. So maybe this is like the wake-up call that the U.S. needs and even humanity globally needs, to find the will and the kind of to awaken enough to actually address the circumstances that we're facing. Because even like the UN COP21 accords, which asked for voluntary compliance from countries. I mean, most of the climate scientists who seem really authoritative said that it really was not even slightly enough. That it was more like kicking the can down the road, than really requiring types of shifts that we would have to make. I mean, some of them talk about needing to reduce CO2 emissions by like 8-10% per year for a while to kind of bring the situation under control. So technically, we know what we would have to do. Like we would have to go to 100% more or less renewable energy as fast as we possibly could. And there's nothing physically preventing us from doing that. I mean, there's been tremendous technological advances that are ongoing. Like solar is now cheaper than fossil fuels. We now have more effective storage systems for solar, like the Tesla Powerwall and so on. But we shouldn't be thinking about doing it in like 50 or 70 or 100 years, like phasing out fossil fuels over all that time. It should be like humanity unites to get it done in like 10 years or 20 years. And there really isn't any reason that we couldn't do that physically. And there are also times in the past when really complex societies like the United States have have changed direction, and usually during wars. So for instance, during the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, the US in 3 months shifted all of its factories to wartime production and taxed the wealthiest people in the society at 94%. So it would have the resources necessary to change, to face the common nemesis. And really, that's where we are in a world situation right now. We have a common foe. It's just, it's harder to identify in that sense than a political, government or something that's gone crazy. So the energy thing, is something that we could potentially solve. It could be, a massive short-term program to get people to train people to install solar and shift, the infrastructure and so on. Agriculture is another major area. I mean, we're now, most of the food is produced through industrial, monoculture farming, and that's very destructive. I mean, according to the UN, the current way we're making food, we have 60 years of harvests left on the planet. And that's because it's depleting the topsoil, right? So there are all sorts of farming practices which replenish or restore topsoil. For instance, no-till agriculture, puts CO2 in the soil, organic permaculture practices, but they require more training, more intensive labor, and it requires like a shift in paradigm. Because once again, we have to recognize that, and kind of what I try to do in the book is look at everything, as an evolutionary process in a sort of systemic way. It's very quick that we've had this industrial age. It's only a few centuries, and the idea of modern progress has been, the country is boring. People are going to leave the country. They're going to come to the cities. They'll have these, interesting factory jobs, and that's what progress means. It's like taking people out of the countries, resettling them in the cities, which is what happened around the world. But now we would have to kind of have a collective moment of realization that that's not a good path. It's not that actually what would be better at this point would be some subset of the population would be trained in ways of farming that replenish the soil and the land, that are actually often more create better yields and so on, and we would kind of repopulate the countrysides and cut up the big agro-business farms into smaller organic plots. And then in terms of industry, the idea would be laid out by William Donahue in this book, Cradle to Cradle, which is essentially this idea that we could, given time, redesign all of our industrial practices, manufacturing practices, so they don't toxify the environment, they feed back neutrally or productively into the environment. McDonough talks about now we have a negative ecological footprint, right? We're using carbon and resources and creating toxins. But he said with a redesign, we ultimately could have a positive ecological footprint. Like every step we take, flowers could bloom and fruit could grow and so on. So for instance, he has this idea that think about packages, like an ice cream wrapper. It could be not only compostable, it could have seeds and mushroom spores in it. So you have the ice cream, you bury the package, and a fruit trees grow, a little garden grows. And he points out that once again, it's like a shift in our logic, because we've had this idea of a one direction of progress and so on, that actually progress could go in different directions. We're a very creative species. Once we choose to try to do something, we can achieve the impossible, right? Flying was once impossible until people figured it out, or the smartphone was once totally impossible. Even in the 50s, when you look at science fiction films, nobody imagined that we could have these types of devices. So we can actually accomplish way more in the direction that we set ourselves in than we think. So setting ourselves in this direction of cradle to cradle industry would obviously be the right thing to do. So that's kind of the technical aspect. I'm not going to go too deep because we don't have that much time tonight. And then the other aspect would be, what's blocking us from making those changes is obviously the political economic system. And it's very clear right now that those are one thing, that we have kind of a corporate, military, government, and in a way Trump, maybe part of the benefit of Trump is that it makes so everything hidden is now totally transparent and clear. When you have Exxon, running the State Department, and Goldman Sachs running the financial system, it doesn't get that much clearer than that, And it's also it's intriguing how there's a certain kind of hyper reality to the whole Trump thing. First of all, his name, obviously, Trump, the Trump card in the deck or something. The Secretary of State is Rex Tillerson. You could shorten that to T-Rex. It's almost like a bizarre, play. Some people think that it sort of is pointing towards the fact that we might live in something like a simulation or a matrix reality or something, which I do discuss in the book a little bit. How would we make shifts in the political and economic system? Well, in terms of economics, we forget that money is a design, is something that is an instrument that humans have kind of designed in a certain way that creates, certain relationships, right? Because our money is, based on debt and, creates interest and so on. It leads to competitive and aggressive behavior patterns, and it innately creates winners and losers. So if somebody gets a loan from the bank, the bank rates them, their credit scores based on how they're going to compete with everybody else in society to get that money back. Because the bank gives you the money for the loan, then you have to compete with everybody for the interest, right? And so it sort of automatically creates winners and losers, and artificial scarcity and so on. So, what would be a replacement for that? One idea that's becoming more and more, kind of prevalent is an idea of shifting to something like a basic income as one aspect of our economic system. If we think about what's happening, for instance, with automation, in a way it should be a reason to celebrate. We could be moving to something like a post-capitalist, post-work society, or a group in England coined the term fully automated luxury socialism. Trump won the election by claiming that he was going to bring back the golden age of industrial manufacturing and bring back all these industrial jobs. We know that that's kind of ridiculous because the automation is increasing, And we already have self-driving vehicles. Like the largest workforce in the U.S. is 3.5 million truck drivers, right? So we have self-driving cars. So 5-10 years, those truck drivers are not going to be needed anymore. Along with a lot of people in these other businesses. But that wouldn't be a problem if we had as a vision or an intention, what's our future here as a society, and if it was towards like a situation where we're creating a post-work culture where people could live in healthy communities, make their own energy, grow some of their own food. If they don't have productive employment, they could be training themselves, educating themselves through the internet or through local systems. It could actually be wonderful. One of my favorite thinkers around all this stuff is actually Oscar Wilde, who's not really thought of as a political thinker, but he wrote a beautiful essay called "The Soul of Man Under Socialism," where he really talks about how in a way automation needs to develop to liberate humanity from drudgery. And this was back a century ago. He recognized this, and he saw that he talked about how artists were kind of the forerunners of the human race, and in the previous centuries, the people who had the time to be artists were often people who had family fortunes, who then were given the opportunity and the time to cultivate their unique creative self, their unique essence, and so on. But most people were denied that, and were kind of frustrated about that, and even angry, at those who did have that time and that opportunity. But he felt that through automation, ultimately we would be able to liberate humanity as a whole. Not that everybody would be an artist, but everybody would have the time, the cultivated leisure, the opportunity to really work on their unique self and develop their unique capacities. So that I think is a beautiful idea, and I guess that was one reason why I felt this book was very necessary to do. I felt that particularly now with the rise of the alt-right and Trump, we're seeing this very, very negative view of the future, which is like more xenophobia, super military buildup, rigid boundaries and so on. And I think we need to have a coherent alternative view of how more amazing the world could be if we come together to deal with the situation. And ultimately, I think the pitch to the world's people would have to be something along the lines of we can have a post-work, quote unquote utopia, in a few decades if we come together and deal with our situation right now. But it's going to require short-term sacrifices, or we could even say, rather than sacrifices, we could say opportunities for self-actualization on the part of the wealthy elite, of the 1% of the population who are using 50% of the resources. And we would pitch it to the world that we're going to reduce meat consumption or eliminate it. Is one of the things that we need to do. Reduce extra houses, extra cars, kind of exotic vacations, but the alternative that we're positing is local utopias, connected communities, and ultimately a shift to a different social model. I think that really is the opportunity. That's the alternative that humanity faces right now. If we keep going down the line that our leaders are pointing us towards, we're not going to make it as a species. And one of the big kind of important thinkers for the book was Buckminster Fuller, and he figured a lot of this out in the 60s. He wrote a book called Utopia or Oblivion, where he saw that humanity was either going to, come together and use its technical capacities to elevate humanity as a whole to a higher state of being, or we wouldn't make it as a species on the planet. And I really feel that, we're in the crux of that right now. So the economic system could be reformed with other instruments to exchange value that would have different patterns of behavior and ideologies kind of built into them. So Bernard Lietaer is an economist who wrote a book called The Future of Money, and he proposes, for instance, negative interest currencies. You have a trading currency that is not hoardable; it loses value when people try to hold on to it. So people will just naturally circulate it rather than seeking to control it. There's a bunch of other ideas in the book along those lines, and we're seeing some super interesting experiments. Like Bitcoin is very interesting. In a way, and Bitcoin is shooting up right now, which is quite fascinating. In a way, I don't know what backs the U.S. dollar, but at least Bitcoin is backed by a very complex mathematical algorithms. and there's only a limited supply that can be mined. So in a weird way, it may ultimately turn out to be like a safer form of currency than the US dollar. And then the idea is that Bitcoin is built on something called the blockchain. And there could be other ways of exchanging value, that experiments that have different kind of patterns of activity built into them. Like you could have a currency that's backed by permaculture credits or something. And then in terms of governance, I think that ultimately what would work would be something that was like scaling up from the kind of local to the bioregional to the planetary. You could use the internet to create decentralized, participatory, democratic systems that would bring more people into the process of making decisions that are of importance. And there are some examples and efforts to do this. One is called Democracy OS, which is like, a system where, you're part of a city or town, you get to choose, you get to vote, but not just every 4 years for a candidate. You get to continuously vote, and you can also change your vote. So for instance, you can, let's say you're not an expert on energy, you proxy your vote to somebody who you trust, but if you then find out that they're taking kickbacks, from Exxon, you take their vote away from them and you give it to somebody else, you try again. So, there's a lot of ideas out there like that. Another tool is called Lumio.org, which is for local communities, and it's being used by a movement in Spain, a grassroots movement called Podemos, as their local organizing tool. So I think we'll see a lot more experiments around these tools in the next years. And I think we could look at government is, hey guys, is a little bit like the form of government that we have, the social organization that we have is very much linked to our form of media. So we could never have had empires like Rome before we had a written code of laws that were distributed. We could never have had the modern nation state that allowed for a limited amount of kind of representational democracy in these types of governments until we had the printing press. And now with the internet, it automatically, I think, points towards a different model for social organizing, which would be, kind of participatory and continuous engagement, not just a representative that, part of one of two corrupt parties that you don't like, that you have to vote for every 4 years. And I definitely feel that a lot of the reason that Trump got elected was just a volatile, sense of fury on the part of the mainstream populace who felt that the whole system was crap anyway. So why choose the lesser evil? So those are some of the ideas in the book, and I want to leave some time for questions. I also, as you heard in the part that I read in the beginning about the Kogi, I also take seriously kind of the more spiritual dimension or the consciousness dimension. And the two of the main kind of underlying kind of themes of the book. One is that we could look at this ecological crisis as something like an initiation or a rite of passage for humanity, and I feel that's kind of helpful, like a shamanic initiation. It's humanity's rite of passage to move from kind of adolescence, egocentrism, irresponsibility, to taking a mature responsibility for the whole collective situation. As something that individuals will have to do, and then the society as large will have to do. So that's the idea. And rites of passage, initiations in traditional and tribal cultures were really events that had a neurophysiological impact on the initiate, who would go through visionary, transpersonal experience, and then be able to anchor a whole different connection to the cosmos back in their ordinary life. And the elders would help give them the context, the myth and the story in which they understood their personal experience as part of the tribal whole in a way. And then another big theme of the book is that we could think about what would happen as a result of this initiation would be this kind of collective realization that humanity as a whole is kind of like a gigantic organism, like a planetary superorganism that is constantly surviving through having a symbiotic relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system. And so we would want to then go back into balance like that, and we could learn a lot from nature and organisms as to how symbiosis works. Apparently, when they look at evolution now, it's the cutting edge way of looking at it is not about competition and survival of the fittest, but realizing that over time cooperation kind of outcompetes competition, and our bodies in themselves are amazing examples of this. There's trillions of cells and microorganisms that learned over millions of years how to function in concert to keep us going. So those are some of the ideas, and maybe you guys have a question or two. Should I? Yeah.
I may have missed the beginning because I came in late. I apologize. But and I heard you just now talk about shamanism and consciousness. So in tribal societies, generally, the shaman of the society used psychedelic substances in order to have these visions, which he then transmuted to the tribe, and in that way was able to give the rest of the tribe the vision. And I'm wondering, in our society today, other than dosing the water supply with LSD, how do you expect to raise consciousness? I think that's a huge problem, and I as somebody who lived in the 60s in my youth, I really believe that the only way today is for each of us to have a sort of a spiritual or contemplative practice, work on ourselves and join in like-minded communities. But I don't see how you're going to convince the elite, the richest, the people who voted for Trump to do this. So that's my main question.
I think that there's a huge, many more people are exploring all sorts of practices, from contemplative practices to shamanism, to ayahuasca is exploding around the world. And in fact, of the people who are exploring these types of things, many of the people, some of the people doing it are among the wealthiest, elites. So that is really happening. And I guess Burning Man is another example where you have the wealthiest people in the world, the heads of lots of the tech companies coming and exploring psychedelics. And but I guess I felt that one reason why I needed to write this book, and it was to provide a little bit of a direction, I guess what Buckminster Fuller calls a trim tab, because it feels like it can also kind of disintegrate just into, taking psychedelics aren't necessarily going to solve social problems unless there's a direction that sort of indicates how those experiences fit into a greater context. And obviously I don't have any, nobody can say how things are going to change for the better, or if they're going to change, but we can look at history and we can actually find that sometimes they do, there are tremendous things that happen without people imagining or anticipating them. So an example of that would be the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? If you go back to the 70s and 80s, no think tank, was saying, the people are going to rise up and they're just going to take the wall down by hand, and the military is just going to let them do that, and then there'll be no Soviet Union anymore. That wasn't even an idea. Everybody assumed that if that was going to happen, it was going to be war and nuclear exchange and so on. So there are times when subliminally people reach a point where change just has to happen, and that change goes through the whole society, including the military and the security apparatus. And I believe when we look at what's happening with Trump and the complete obvious idiocy of the situation, it has to be becoming something like that has to be spreading through the social psyche in a way. If that maybe answers. But the other thing I was going to say is that but when the Berlin Wall fell, why didn't it go in a good direction? So what happened was, from my perspective, I don't know if anybody read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. It's a really excellent book. So she looked at how there were these neoliberal economists who didn't like the 60s. They didn't like the Great Society. They didn't like the fact that the middle class was growing wealthier and people were getting more education, and therefore they were dissenting in different ways and creating movements towards civil liberties and so on. So they were our time is not now, but we are going to put our act together and we're going to be ready for when we have an opportunity. So then they created academic think tanks and different policy organizations, lobbying groups. And then they when Reagan came in, they became powerful. This was Milton Friedman was the leader of this group. Milton Friedman even said that when a crisis comes, the ideas that get applied are the ones that are lying around. So our job is to be ready to get those ideas out so that we're the ones who get to determine the direction of change, essentially. So that's when the Berlin Wall came down, the Chicago School of neoliberal economists rushed into all those countries and were like, oh, this is what you do. You sell off all of these resources, the state-owned resources to the highest bidder, and you privatize everything. And so then that led to the oligarchies, the kleptocracies, to the Putin situation. So since we can basically guarantee that there's going to be another set of crises coming up, part of my thinking with this book, and I think there are other books that mirror and resonate with it, is how do we create a whole different set of ideas, for how things could change in a positive direction, where we could have a more equitable sharing of resources, decentralization of power. Kind of an integration of our oh, I just went down. Or whatever. You can hear me anyway, I think.
It's back on.
What's that?
It's back on.
It's back on, right? Decentralization of power and so on. No? But anyway, so that was kind of the idea.
I don't know quite how to say it, but isn't there a certain percentage that can mass in terms, let's say, the principles that you're talking about tonight? If there are enough of us, even though, so let's say we're only 1% of the whole, it's powerful enough to affect the rest, and it can be the shift. So it's I know she's concerned about just us and the whole rest of the world, not thinking correctly, but there's a way that I guess you would say is probably a spiritual way. You understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's true, but then also sometimes there needs to be like missionary work in a way, and I feel like one thing that happened over the last decades in a way that like a lot of the progress has been happening on the coasts, financial, but also like cultural and like exchanging of knowledge and shifts in how people relate to each other and so on, but it kind of remained in a kind of insular situation. I mean, in my book, I even argue that I wasn't, I talk about how I wasn't even that sad when Harbin Hot Springs burned down. So I was like, maybe it's time for all those hippies to like go to the red states, and take all these ideas they've been talking about, and smoking pot and talking about for decades, and actually like bring them to the people who don't have them yet, So yes, but I mean, we don't know. There's this idea of like morphic resonance or a tipping point, and there do seem to be times and examples when that kind of thing happens. But I think that combined with actually maybe people getting more forceful about expressing and acting more publicly with their beliefs.
Yeah, I've been working with a lot of families around the world, but in the U.S. and in California, there are thousands and thousands of parents who've been fighting for health freedom for their kids. And I mean thousands that show up to spend 1 second at a microphone, to only be shut down and shamed and ridiculed and literally bowled over for what they're doing. There's another bill on its way now that removes all rights from parents in California. California has twisted up so badly. So these families, I mean, there's 20,000 now even just trying to fight this next thing. And now people are saying, what are the dark forces here? I mean, they're actually asking me tonight on my way here, ask him, what are the dark forces we're up against? Because there are so many people that actually are conscious. Many of these people are Californians that voted for Trump because they think that he can help their kid. So I mean, it's crazy. So they're saying, what are the dark forces, the unseen forces that we're actually up against for people who actually have moved into consciousness but can't break through. They can't get where they're going.
Are you talking about vaccinations in particular?
Vaccinations and GMO. The families, the woman Pam Larry, who was on the no GMO front in California for years when they had the vote, and we had 3 sellouts, including Stonyfield Farms and Whole Foods, who literally went against what they had told all of these people for years. So everybody's having to go back, retool, feeling completely devastated. And then the vaccine issue as well. Like, we have lots of vaccine-injured kids. So the question is, what's this thing in the way of these conversations happening and movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that we have to recognize, I mean, like things are sometimes complicated, and people sort of always are looking for sort of dualistic and simple, kind of answers. And so, for instance, like I'm not an expert like on vaccines, but my guess is that it's very, very complicated, because I think that the vaccines did do a lot of good, for the last century and prevented a lot of, terrible diseases and so on. I mean, I think, and I don't think the intention of a lot of the people who are, doing the vaccines is terrible. But then also, then there are pharmaceutical companies who maybe profit on there being too many of them and so on. And and now, of course, because those diseases are much less prevalent, like a few people can pull their kids out of that system. But what would happen if like millions of people pulled their kids out of their system? Like, would we then see a huge rise up in all sorts of childhood diseases that we now have almost like eradicated? It's these are very complicated. I think what we need is more like public discourse, like almost like tribal councils where people are like not retracting into very simplistic ideas of like dark and light. Now, obviously I mean I'm pretty much against GMOs because I don't think, and I talk about it in the book, we don't know what their long-term consequences are, and so on. But on the other hand, if we look at what's happening to the, at the moment we have enough food for the earth, for the planet. If the temperatures skyrocket, and we have mega droughts, and suddenly we're looking at 40 degrees Celsius temperature warmer, we may be in a situation where we need to, use some technologies because we're going to need like, fast-growing, drought-resistant crops that can propagate in much hotter climates, But I mean, I totally agree that the pharmaceutical companies seem to be some of the worst companies in the world. So one of the arguments in the book is that, we have to sort of to step back and think a little bit differently about what a multinational corporation is. Because it's very easy to get very angry at them, and there's good reasons to get very angry at them. But in a sense, like, if we think about this idea that the human, the collective humanity is like a giant organism, I think we can almost see the multinational corporations as the primitive versions of kind of organs of that collective body. So like an energy company is like, the blood circulation system in the body, or a media company is like the perceptual aspects that take in raw sense data and convert it into kind of directives that the whole body then follows in what it does. The sanitation company is like the liver and the kidneys, it's like breaking down waste material and so on. But the problem is that, in this brief evolutionary rush that we've been on, we created the corporation as an artificial life form in a sense, and we put it into a game that we created called the stock market. And we gave the corporation one prime directive, which is to maximize profit or shareholder value. So that's basically exactly what a corporation must do to survive. So a corporation, as a kind of artificial life form or entity, then is going to self-select for sociopathic character types, because those are the ones who are going to have the least conscience about doing things that are awful. And that corporation is also going to automatically do things like corrupt, environmental restrictions, ignore, evidence around the harm of smoking or fossil fuels or whatever, because it has a, it's only the only rationale we've given that thing to continue is that it has to keep growing its bottom line. So ultimately we have to recognize that it's a design problem. And if we were to make a shift from this kind of competitive dominator system to a cooperative and symbiotic system, what are now corporations might be transformed as a more like cooperative, transparent infrastructure. That everybody would just understand and see all the inner workings of it. It wouldn't be like hidden, behind as it is now. So that's like I guess that's a long answer to your question, but those are some of my ways of thinking about it. Yeah.
On the note of raising awareness and consciousness, what's happening with your woke network, and when might there be some opportunity for activist journalists to get involved?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the moment, the woke network is a little bit stalled because I'm roaming around the country promoting this book. Send me an email, daniel.pinchbeck@gmail.com, and we probably launch. Probably the easiest, way to start will be something like a user-generated, social platform or something, and then build from there. Maybe a Medium-based or something. But it's still information, and I'm curious to get input also.
How would it be different from, say, Reality Sandwich?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I started a company years ago called Evolver that publishes a web magazine called Reality Sandwich. And it was very focused kind of on like, shamanism, consciousness, psychedelics. And I'd love to do something now that was, much more focused on, mainstream society and, wasn't as much subcultural. In retrospect, I wish it had been oriented a little bit differently. Yeah. No, it's somebody else who hasn't spoken? Yeah.
I've liked all your books, and I really like, I like the vision you project into the future. You've got great ideas for how things might work in the future, but I still don't see how the white working class is going to respond to this. Everybody that voted for Trump. I mean, have you even gone into the red states to try to sell your book, and what kind of response do you get? I just don't see how this is going to go over with them. These are folks that want to retreat to the 50s and keep all people of color out and have things the way they were back when. But so this audience resonates with this. It's not a problem, but
Yeah.
you see what I'm
The
saying?
book's only been out for 2 weeks. I haven't gone into the dark heart of the red states. It was a minority of the U.S. population that created this circumstance, right? I mean, a large group, but still a minority. And in some ways, like I think if Bernie Sanders had run against Trump, it's very likely that Bernie Sanders would have defeated him.
Yeah, I agree.
So, and a lot of the people who who supported Trump for various reasons, like her, the vaccines and so on. I mean, are not necessarily into the white supremacist kind of agenda, and yeah. So it's and once again over the next years, I think this thing is if he holds power, which will be an interesting question. It's gonna become more and more apparent to many people that it's like off the rails. I don't know. I mean, I'm just doing what I can do from my point of view, and giving it my best shot. I mean, I don't see why there couldn't be, a strategic intervention like Breitbart or like the way they use Cambridge Analytica to kind of psychologically profile all the people in the U.S. and target messages at them in the other direction. You could use those same tools, but target messages of like, okay, like, the type of stuff that I'm writing in my book. Like, we could go to renewable energies, would actually create a short-term jobs program that would be incredibly beneficial for people. Plus, ultimately, you'd be able to live in safe, self-sufficient communities without the threat of, terrorism and so on. I think that it could be marketed, promoted, branded, as this thing has been branded. With even working with like linguists, anthropologists, and social psychologists to think about all the different segments of society and what types of words they resonate with and so on. I don't see why you couldn't do a similar thing.
I mean, do you see that it's important to engage with people in the red states?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's almost like, as I said, it's almost like anthropology or social psychology. You need to think about, and this is what Bannon did, with winning this election. It's like figure out what types of messages, they word choices, messages they respond to, but have the content of those messages and word choices be about, how do we, make this world work for everybody.
They're realistic.
Yeah.
How will your vision be financed?
I mean, I don't have all of the answers, and I tried very hard with my last company to get financing from every wealthy person I came across, and it was a struggle, And I don't know if my vision will be something that I enact, maybe other people pick it up, or maybe it won't get enacted. I mean, for me, I felt that the necessity of doing this, and it took me like 10 years, which was to develop like a coherent concept of how the world could go in this other direction, what that would look like, and what that would mean in these different areas, and the next step will be determined not just by me but by all of us.
What's a typical reaction from some of these wealthy people you approach?
Typical reaction. Well, everybody is very distracted right now, and everybody also has a slew of their own pet causes, So like, I know one very wealthy person, in England, whose pet cause is like, these albinos in Africa who are getting their, hands chopped off and stuff like that, because there's all this racism against them. And, it's beautiful, they're really suffering, but I feel there's a little bit of a tendency for people to look at, all these symptoms of horror and kind of address maybe one symptom. And what I was trying to do is get to a more like causal level, because I don't think we need to figure that out, and sort of have a coherent intention, If that makes sense.
I think I heard a podcast from you a while ago where you talked about the apocalypse, or more than one apocalypse, and that being mentioned in some of these ancient traditions. And I really wonder now, we've got a president who's very impulsive and likes to provoke for attention about global warming, and then all this mass immigration, which seems to be fueled by global warfare, or rather guerrilla and breakdown of societies. So do you see these apocalypses coming about now, and what do the ancient traditions say? Is there any hope?
Yeah, well, the word apocalypse, traditionally means revealing or uncovering.
Right.
So, it can be a time of destruction, but also a time of creation, but also a time when knowledge is liberated. And, in all the traditions, it doesn't mean the end of everything. It means a transformation, And once again, like, I can't say if, who knows if there's going to be catastrophes and wars that lead to millions of people dead. I certainly hope that doesn't happen, and I believe that it doesn't have to happen, because I believe that if we were to have a, collective awakening tomorrow, we could think about our situation, and follow, the type of ideas that I put forward in the book. So for instance, and once again, it's really about the developed world having to take a lot of responsibility for what we've unleashed, because we've used the majority of the resources and the fuel and so on. Bangladesh is 170 million people living at 0 to 5 meters above sea level. So their groundwater is going to be, not available for them for farming in the next 10 or 20 years as sea levels rise. India is building a big wall to keep them out of India. Stuff like that's going to be happening all over the world, But people could be resettled. Even if we lost 100 feet, which is the highest predictions with sea level rise, that would be 5% of the Earth's surface. There would still be plenty of room to settle people. Like, you could apparently settle the entire population, human population, in an area the size of Texas, and people would still have room for like a backyard, area. So it's not about, it's more about the inefficient use of resources and the excess consumption and so on. And we are very innovative and creative. And one of the, I guess in terms of the apocalypse idea, another way to think about it is maybe this is actually the necessary prelude to like the opening of the human heart chakra, like the full flowering of us coming into the fourth chakra and the heart center, and realizing that we can't allow, this type of, calamity and destruction to happen.
Well, given your analysis of the situation and your vision of what might be, if I could use the idea of acupuncture points, do you see particular points where each of us individually can take action, maybe a variety of such?
Yeah, in the last section of the book, I do talk about that. But I guess the deeper thing would be that, we all have particular like skills and expertise and so on, and in a way I think like we would all draw on that. So if somebody's a lawyer, they can be helping Monsanto, or they can be putting some of their energy into trying to protect indigenous land rights or something. If somebody's great with plants, they can help build permaculture, rooftop gardens, or develop new systems, aquaponic systems, or whatever. So there's obviously things that are good to do individually, but then also it's going to have to also ultimately be a collective movement. So Like a lot of times people don't do things that they know would be beneficial because they feel that their individual actions aren't going to have any value. But if we could use maybe the internet to mesh people's actions together, so like if somebody knew when they became vegetarian, like 1 million other people were becoming vegetarian on that day, and then they could see that would lead to this much less deforestation, this much less CO2, maybe they'd be willing to take that step together. Yeah.
So you talked about collective awakening. So do you see that as a prerequisite for real progressive positive change?
Well, I mean, it could be collective awakening, or it could be, kind of a small group that awakens and creates systems and structures that help other people to change their patterns of behavior and in a way that makes their lives better. I mean, that's like the Dalai Lama, talked about how like everybody's just looking for a better life. So if you can show them a way to do that, then they'll go in that direction. So I think about like a friend of mine, for instance, created the platform Couchsurfing, which was like a forerunner to Airbnb. But it was a way that people could go all around the world and stay for free with people, make new friends, and there was like a trust network behind it. So you could have like make Couchsurfing for everything in a way, so that people could share resources really easily or find rides really easily. I mean, the social technology could allow us to do a huge amount. And once those possibilities are available, I think people would sign on to them. I mean, that's why, like, for instance, I find like Burning Man quite inspiring, because you see how fast human nature can change. And then there are a lot of problems with Burning Man. It's very hedonistic and wasteful, but people go there and they're told they can't use money, that it's a gift economy and leave no trace, inclusiveness and so on. And it's not like it takes them like a month to figure it out. Like in 2 hours, they're like, oh, like this is better. Like if I, give gifts and leave no trace and like share my drugs and wear a tutu, I'm gonna have better friends. I'm gonna get laid more. I'm in. So I think all you have to do is figure out how to give people a better life, and they'll immediately move in that direction and adopt that. So. Yeah.
You've done a marvelous job of explaining all this and answering people's questions. And if you have further questions, you could probably talk with Daniel afterwards.
Yeah.
But I would like to give a round of applause for sharing your brilliance. And you can actually purchase this book right now at all 3 registers. And Daniel has agreed to sign the book. And you can come up here. Open it to this page, and I will put your exact name on there. So it'll be autographed to you. And thank you again for coming. We also have, this is the beginning of the month, so we have our new calendar. I think somebody over there has a calendar, so you can wave it in front. It's also at the registers. Yeah, there you are, you have one. And it has all these events. Did people get this from the event today, from the calendar? Yeah, cool. So there's a lot of great events coming up, and this is a great way to start our March. So thank you very much again. Okay.